Welcome to E2Talks. It's a podcast where we chat about the English language landscape, talking about topics relevant to students like you. In this episode, Jay talks to Dr. Helen Zhao. Helen is a lecturer in Applied Linguistics at the University of Melbourne. Among other topics, she researches how best to teach and learn English grammar. Jay and Helen discuss two parts of English grammar in depth: the use of articles, a, an, the, and the use of prepositions. Helen found that there are 90 uses of articles in English, like using the for the Himalayas, and no article if you mention a mountain like Mount Everest. Second, they discuss prepositions, words like in and over. It turns out that for each preposition there is a central spatial meaning, like the water is in the glass. And then there are many more metaphorical meanings, such as being in love. And these secondary metaphorical meanings come from the central meaning. So, if you're interested in how to best teach and learn English grammar, then this podcast is for you. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, welcome back to E2 Talks. My name is Jay. I'm one of the expert teachers here at E2 Language and E2 School, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Helen Zhao. Hello Helen, how are you?
Hi, good, thanks.
You good?
Yep.
That's good. Thanks for coming on. You came down to our office, 4 months ago or something?
Perhaps.
And gave us some professional development on how to teach and learn grammar, which was really interesting. And I think all of us appreciated that because it's such a complex part of language learning. And one of the things that we try to do at E2 Language is keep up to date with all of the academic research as much as possible to make sure what we're doing is actually valid and we're not just making it up as we go. We're actually trying to do it as best as possible. So I thought I might just start by asking you about your academic background. Can you tell me what you do for a job and what your research interests are?
I'm currently a lecturer in Applied Linguistics in the School of Languages and Linguistics in the University of Melbourne. And I got my PhD in second language acquisition from Carnegie Mellon University, which is a private university in Pittsburgh, the United States.
Okay.
And my current research areas include second language acquisition, especially acquisition of English, and pedagogical grammar, so teaching grammar to second language learners of English, computer-assisted language learning, so exploring ways of applying technology-supported especially grammar learning, in supporting English language learning. And something else is, for example, cognitive linguistics, which will be more theoretical.
Okay, so there are a few things there that are really applicable to us. One is pedagogical grammar, how to teach grammar most effectively, and computer-assisted language learning. So E2 Language is 100% online, so we're trying to I think we're kind of dare I say, state of the art at the moment with our teaching and learning practices, because we do not have classrooms and we do not have chairs and we do not have physical students. We have interactions in cyberspace, which is pretty interesting. I personally think that that's the way language learning will head in the future. I don't think it's going to turn around. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. Technology-mediated or technology-supported language learning is definitely the new trend.
Yeah.
In research in the field of second language acquisition, we've seen major influence and major publications in this area, but I think there's still quite a long way to go.
Yeah, that was my experience. So I did my master's degree at the University of Melbourne and I specialised in computer-assisted language learning. And I read not a lot of the literature, but a bit. And it seemed to me that it was quite behind.
It is. I think that's the general feeling. So I think we are still looking forward to more kind of major publications as milestone publications for this field. It's relatively, in terms of research and publications, I think it lags behind the actual classroom practices that's going on.
Okay, interesting.
And there's only one kind of really international conference held every year called Calico.
Okay.
That's specifically dedicated to computer-assisted language learning.
Right.
But I think there are more elements that talks about the actual practices rather than research
Okay.
wise.
Right.
I mean, dense in research. So yeah, I think this is still a rising area of research.
I have a question. Do you think, like, there's a popular app, for example, called Duolingo, and there's some other commercially available products out there. Do you think they are the companies, or that's the technology that's going to advance the field, or do you think it'll come from a university?
I think commercial efforts are actually quite far more advanced than research-wise.
Right.
In terms of core research that's going on among academia. Duolingo is quite successful. And whether it's going to be the future, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, neither am I. It's a fascinating time, I think, for this technology. I feel like at the moment there's, especially with the emergence of good VoIP, like Skype and Zoom, these sorts of products, and now that the internet's quite stable, and a lot of countries have stable internet, that, and also just with advancements in just websites generally, I think it's finally sort of reached a point where I think if somebody does put it all together, so it can have that sort of teacher interaction with the good computer-assisted activity training and stuff. Anyway, this is obviously my thing.
I mean, Duolingo is great in terms of providing lots of really authentic learning materials for the learners. So there's lots of input. That's quite important. And they seem to introduce quite a lot of these gaming elements into their design, which is actually quite important for prompting what we call time on task. So keep learners to kind of always focus on the tasks. And be attentive during learning, which is very important in as shown by second language acquisition research. So and lots of these practice trials with rich input and good sort of incentive mechanisms that keep students focused and interested. So these are all wonderful things offered by materials created, for example, by Duolingos.
Yeah, motivations is a big one. We're obsessed with our analytics, and one of the metrics that we look at all the time is page view duration, how long a student will sit on a page for. Because it means unless they've gone and they're getting a cup of tea or something, if they are sitting there and they're doing an activity. And so ours at the moment for E2 School is, I think it's about 8 minutes on average per page, which means that they're actually in there doing activities, listening, reading, writing, actually learning the language, which is fabulous.
Yeah. There are these large-scale kind of learner analytics studies, not done actually on language learning, but to do with learning sciences in general, but about these technology-supported science learning that shows that actually time on task is one of the most critical elements. So regardless of how you design your activity, it looks like how much time students actually stay focused on a certain piece of task is the most critical determiner
because without
of successful
that, you
learning.
Don't have anything,
exactly.
Do you? Yeah, because then you're not learning, you're not studying. Yeah, interesting. There was a little tangent for you. Let's talk about your language learning journey. So what's your first language?
My first language is Mandarin Chinese.
Okay. And you speak any other languages apart from English?
Apart from English, I also speak Cantonese.
Okay, right.
As an adult, purely as an adult learner, because I lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years.
Gotcha. Right.
And I was a naturalistic learner of Cantonese. And apart from that, I was an adult learner of French for a couple of years, but pretty much forgot almost all of it.
Did you learn French in France?
No, in college, purely as French
gotcha.
as a foreign language.
It makes it much harder, doesn't it?
That's why this language, what we call language attrition. So basically, you lose the language after you acquire the language. It's quite significant when it comes to my French.
Yeah, because I did this. I studied Indonesian in Indonesia for 1 year, and at the end of that year, I was quite good. And now it's been 10 years, and the attrition.
It kind of erode.
I've lost a lot of
over time.
vocabulary.
Yeah.
So how did you learn English? What was your path to? Obviously, you're an academic now, and you write academic English. And how did you get from zero to that?
My experience of learning English wasn't particularly different from, I guess, the majority of Asian learners learning English. So back at that time, I started to learn English in grade 3 primary school. So when I was about 9 years old, slightly past the critical period, or the so-called critical period in language learning. And at that time, what's the dominant way of teaching English in China was the so-called, the old models of teaching English, the so-called grammar translation. You teach the foreign language by teaching translation, or the audiolingual way. So you would hear you would see the teachers bring like a cassette player to every class and then basically play the cassette. That's the authentic input. And students would do a lot of mimicking, imitations of conversations or sentences in the language textbooks. And so that's pretty much was the old way that I learned English. There was a heavy emphasis on vocabulary, on grammar, on reading and writing. There was no emphasis about communicative language learning because learning English was pretty much for the sake of passing exams and have a good score. So that was my pre-college kind of English learning experiences. And then I became an English major. And then I went to Beijing Foreign Studies University. It's like one of the best foreign language universities in China. And then that was really when I started to kind of refine my English language learning. So I really systematically got training in speaking, in listening, and extensive reading, because before college the reading was quite limited. So extensive reading and exposure to large amount of authentic materials in different genres really happens in college. And then listening was also a skill that was quite inadequate before I entered college. So I really paid a lot of efforts in kind of cultivating listening skills in college.
Yeah, listening's the one skill for me in Indonesian that gives me anxiety.
Absolutely.
Because I feel like an idiot when I'm listening and I just don't quite get it, or I'm catching 40% and I sort of get the gist, and
it's frustrating.
It's frustrating. It makes you feel like a child, or it makes you feel silly.
Yeah, it's a high anxiety task.
Yeah.
It's difficult, and so the way that I trained listening was really pretty much adopting the way that the professors there in that university trains listening. They've been using this method for training listening for years, for decades. So they started with something small and slower. So they show learners with the kind of the modified version of authentic listening materials. Typically that you can adjust the speed to a slower one, and then learners will listen to these kind of modified materials over and over again to try to understand the gist of the meanings in a listening passage, and then gradually get to the the sentence and the vocabularies. And then you gradually move on to kind of faster speeds, to more sort of authentic speed of speech. And it's a gradual process of training to adapt to authentic speech.
There's so much in it, like connected speech, when all the words blend together, and what did you get up to on the weekend, sort of, that sort of, it just sounds like one big word, but in fact, if you parse it out, if you cut it up into its little pieces, it's like, oh, there's the verb there, and there's the article, for example. It's tricky stuff. Oh, that's very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, quick question: if you could go back and do it all again, how would you learn English differently? Like, what would be the most efficient way, do you think?
I'm not sure if there is the most efficient way. I'm always kind of
There's
not
no
sure.
magic
I really don't know, because language learning is such a complicated process.
Unbelievably complicated.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think there's a magic bullet for all.
Yeah.
If you see some extremely successful second language learners who learn the second language in a foreign language context but very successful, he or she must have paid such perseverance and efforts in the language learning, and probably is supported by good foreign language aptitude.
Okay, yeah, so that's a thing?
That's definitely a thing.
Okay,
so learners with strong foreign language aptitude will have an easier time. But, it's difficult. But if I learn it in a different way, I would definitely want to push my exposure to authentic materials to an earlier stage. Because I feel like as I said, my kind of more exposure to authentic materials came in really quite late, until college years. So before that, listening, reading are quite limited. And I did not care about communicative language teaching, language learning at all. That was really kind of influenced by the way that English was taught at that time. I think nowadays it's changed. So the whole mindset has been different. So learners need to realize that they don't learn English just for the sake of passing exams. That's not really the most successful model of learning English. It's a really wrong conceptualization of language learning.
Yeah, it's funny because we do IELTS preparation and PTE preparation, and even for E2 school we're connecting our courses with some Cambridge certificates. So it's a good incentive, I think. Like, it's nice to work towards something, but it definitely shouldn't be the focus. I think that's wrong. Yeah, if you're just doing exam prep, pretty much, and a lot of our students do. And unfortunately, some of our students who they don't have the fundamental skills, and yet they'll still just focus on those exam prep topics. And, they need to go back and improve their grammar, build the vocabulary, refine their pronunciation.
Oh, you definitely need to prepare to do the hard work of preparing for the exams, to really cultivate your skills and the basic skills, the vocabulary, the grammar. You've got to do those things. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do those things. Exams are important. It's very important pragmatic motivators for language learning. But studies also shows that learners who only have a very kind of instrumental motivation, that sort of pragmatic motivation for learning English, may not be as successful as learners who actually develop a really kind of more holistic interests towards the language learning.
Do you think that's also, if somebody's interested in the culture as well, that helps?
Yeah, definitely. Someone who is interested in the culture, when you're motivated, when you have a more kind of integrated motivation, you will look for materials to listen to read, and you may write, and you will interact with people. So that's more that will create much more, many more opportunities for you to use the language in all dimensions. Then you're not going to be satisfied with reciting a few vocabularies, learning a few grammar items. Right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's so much media out there nowadays. Like Netflix, for example, now has subtitles, and I think if you sat there and watched Netflix for a long time with subtitles and in your first language, and then with the English subtitles, so things like that are very helpful, especially if you're into the TV show or the movie and you really want to watch it and you want to know what they're saying. There's lots of stuff like that out there.
Exactly, it's quite helpful. Yeah, it's actually It's an interesting research question in computer-assisted language learning about the effectiveness of these caption videos in supporting language learning. So that's something that I'm also quite interested.
Yeah, here's an anecdotal story. Just from my limited language learning history with Indonesian, I did find watching movies, Indonesian movies with the Indonesian subtitles extremely helpful, because I could make that connection between the spoken and the written, because they speak so quickly, and often you miss it. But if it's written there, it's like, oh, that's it. You can
Yeah.
also catch a little bit of the grammar too. Oh, they've used that type of verb there. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. It's particularly helpful with low proficiency, when you're at a lower proficiency or low intermediate proficiency. But for advanced learners, it can be distracting
Okay, right.
because they already understand it.
Yes.
Yeah, and then seeing the subtitles kind of eliminate your job of trying to get it. So that it could go to the negative side of helping you to learn the language. So it's still quite interesting, something that that definitely deserves further research.
Yes. Okay, so I want to talk about grammar because you're, well, I consider you and I should mention Amber as well. She considers you an expert, the expert perhaps in grammar. And I want to talk about the use of articles in particular because as a teacher, I've taught in the classroom I taught in the classroom for about 8 years. And I would do the typical grammar lesson where I'd stand at the front of the classroom and say, okay, we're going to learn about a, an, and the English articles. And we use the for a specific thing and we use a for a non-specific thing. And those students in the class who had articles in their first language would be okay, the Spanish speakers, for example. But those Koreans or Chinese or other languages where they don't have articles never got it. And my lessons were always taught in vain. They just didn't work. So what is it about articles, do you think, that is just so hard for somebody to get?
I definitely agree with the cross-linguistic differences here being one of the most important reason for justifying why so many learners have trouble.
Yeah.
English is one of article system is quite unique.
Okay.
English is only one of the few languages in the world that have the article system. There are quite a lot of languages in the world that does not have an article system.
Yeah.
For example, most Asian languages, including Mandarin Chinese, Cantonese, Japanese, Korean, and probably Indonesian too, and most Slavic languages, Russian, Croatian, and many, many African languages. So for learners from these language backgrounds, they really have a hard time with understanding that, I need to supply an article and when to use an article. Another important reason for why articles is different is because with my theoretical background in functional linguistics is because of the complex form-function mapping. So I understand grammar as a systems of form-function mapping. So for example, with regard to English articles, there are three types of forms. The definite article the, the indefinite article a, and you have an as another variation, and then the zero article. So these three forms are mapped onto approximately 90 different functions. Functions such as first mention, second mention, and you also have second mention with variation. So it's like, I went to Melbourne. The city is interesting. So the city is like a second mention of Melbourne, but with variation. But you can tell that just from this immediate context of the two sentences that the city refers to Melbourne. So there are lots of these idiosyncratic functions that are not so frequently used. These are the so-called proper nouns in the traditional grammatical definitions. For example, names of buildings, names of mountains, names of political institutions, names of geographic features and all these things.
Okay, so they're the rare ones.
These are the rare ones.
So when I say Mount Everest versus the Himalayas, that's a uncommon usage.
Compared to the more kind of frequently used, for example, first mention, second mention, these functions are much, much more frequently used. So learners hear them a lot from the input, and learners have to use them because you've got to supply an article with in the noun.
So you're saying there are 90
phrases.
of these?
90 of these, and some very, very frequent ones. The kind of the type frequency is very low, but the token frequency is very high. But you also have quite a lot of these idiosyncratic functions that in terms of type frequency, you've got a large number of them, but each one of them have very few tokens, actually, in the English language. So learners will have very little chance of being exposed to these idiosyncratic functions.
Okay.
And these are really the most complicated functions with English articles.
Now, this was your research? You found out that there were 90 functions?
Yes, this originally came from my dissertation research.
How did you find out that there were 90 functions?
It originated, originally I compiled like basically the major English grammar books.
Okay.
That's the original list. And then...
and how many did you find in those books?
Maybe 80. So,
okay.
So it's quite a lot. It's years of work
but I
that goes
those
into
books
that.
would have been different, like some said this
Oh, yeah,
number.
very different.
Yeah.
So then you have to compare, because different grammar books call the same function different names, and you've got to compare, and the way that they do categorizations are different. So I try to come up with the most surface, the most bottom up categorization of the functions.
Okay.
And then back at that time, my PhD supervisor and I, we spent almost half a year in trying to apply all these 80 functions originally extracted from grammar books, encoding authentic English texts, written texts of 10 different genres in American English. By compiling our own little corpus.
Okay.
And so we just basically spent time in doing the application of the coding scheme, and then lots of negotiation and discussion about whether this function applies or not, and then create new functions, categories that are not included in the...
Wow.
In
Was
the,
it exciting
in the
when
books.
you found a new category?
It takes a long time to really, create
sure
one
that you've
new
got
one
one.
and then
Yeah.
describe it. Like, what is that? Yeah.
Amazing. Because when we came across this research, when you talked to us about it, when I had that brief conversation with you the first time I met you, I was like, that's it. I don't yet know exactly how we're going to apply it in E2 school to teach articles, but I'm like, that's the research we need. Because for me, what it does, although there are a lot, obviously 90, but the way I thought about it was you start with the simpler ones, that the mountain versus the mountain range, for example. It's just very easy to grasp. It's like, okay, great, mountains I use, the mountain ranges I don't use. Sorry, vice versa. Mountain ranges use the mountains don't use an article.
Right.
So that to me seems pretty straightforward. Much more conceptually simple than talking about first mention, second mention, or specificity or something like that. Actually, while we're on it, just briefly, how do you see the applied use of that in the classroom? How would you, if you were to be teaching English and you were going to teach articles, what would you do?
I have run a couple of experiments, and all of these are actually technology-supported tutors.
Interesting.
I haven't really taught article in classroom-based research, but I guess the approach would be really the same. So the way that I teach article, which I find to be effective through these experiments, is to contrast form-function mappings. So for example, I teach students, in the tutor that I designed, learners are exposed to contrasting sentences such as Alice is interested in wealth versus Alice is interested in the wealth of her parents. So learners' attention are directly drawn to the critical feature of her parents, which is the prepositional phrase, that basically push the use of basically justifies definiteness. And that pushes the use of the definite article. So learners really needs to be shown that, okay, that's the critical feature that I need to look for in order to know which function I need to choose. And showing contrast is a really good way of helping learners to learn this. And so instead of learning 90 different form function mappings, If you just organize the 90 functions into kind of pairs or contrasts like these, you can dramatically, significantly
45.
reduce exactly the learning load.
Right.
And helps learners to organize their knowledge space.
Okay.
So it helps a lot with knowledge storage.
And do you think explicit teaching in that is helpful as well, or just the noticing? So explicitly saying...
Yeah, this is it. So learners need lots of practice trials with lots of examples and at the same time explicit feedback.
Okay, explicit feedback and explanation. Wow.
Because
yeah.
Actually in our definition, by simply directing their attention to these contrasting sentences is already quite explicit.
Right, okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's now talk about prepositions, because it seems to me that they are the other part of grammar that almost everybody struggles with. Even for those languages which are more similar to English. For example, Spanish speakers, I hear them making errors with their prepositions all the time. In fact, sometimes I think, is there any logic to the preposition, like the use of at or on or in or towards? Is there a logic there, or is it just arbitrary and you just have to memorize it? What do you think?
It's not arbitrary. There are systematic ways of using prepositions.
Right.
It's absolutely not arbitrary.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, my view to preposition is it's the same kind of adopts the same theoretical view as my view to articles. It's also form function mappings.
Okay. Yeah.
So with prepositions, the form function mappings is different. Articles, you have like 3 forms that are mapped onto like these 90 different functions. That's the form function mapping picture with articles. Preposition-wise is different because you have more prepositions, so you have more forms. And each one of these preposition forms have 2 general functions that are mapped onto them. The spatial functions.
Okay, for example?
That's the original meaning. So for example, the preposition in, the basic spatial function is containment.
Yes.
So the water is in the glass.
Yeah.
So it expresses containment. On, the basic spatial meaning for on is support. And also contact.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And at, the basic function is to point.
Right.
That's the basic spatial meaning for these different prepositions. And then another important kind of category of function that carries by prepositions is what we call the sort of the metaphorical or the extended functions. So preposition can encode time. In 5 minutes at 10 o'clock on Sunday.
Yeah.
They can also express these sort of more metaphorical meanings. For example, in love.
So you're contained, you're in something, right?
Right,
you're
exactly.
Contained by an emotion. Perhaps.
Yeah, so the I come from a kind of theoretical perspective that views that there's a systematic connections between these spatial functions of prepositions and their extended meanings.
Okay.
And then the way that I teach preposition is to show learners these systematic connections.
Right.
By first of all, try to help them to really understand the most accurate spatial meaning for these prepositions. And then show them that these spatial meanings generates extended meanings, the metaphorical meanings.
The metaphorical meanings.
Yeah, because the metaphorical meanings are more abstract and more difficult for the learners.
Yes.
But if learners can understand the spatial meaning, it will help them to understand the extended meanings.
Okay, so you can trace it back to its sort of more original spatial meaning.
Yeah, so learners wouldn't necessarily automatically make the association between in love and in the glass. But you will need to tell them that actually both of them express certain concepts about containment, whether it's contained in a physical space or it's contained in a mental space. Right, but it's both a containment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I mean, as a teacher, that at least gives me some hope that I can teach these words to people and they'll make some sort of sense to them, because sometimes you look at them and you think, okay, I'm sorry, you'll just have to memorize this. But if I do find a sort of the original meaning, like the spatial meaning, for example, and then teach the metaphorical, what comes out of that could help. Can you just give me a few more examples of a sort of the basic original meaning and then a metaphor? Like we talked about in water in the glass and in love. What's another one we can
For in?
Or any preposition?
The most complex preposition is over.
Over.
Yeah, it has the largest amount of meanings attached to it.
So going from A to B would be the original meaning? Is that the sort of...
Yes. So it's...
But there's something in the way.
There are arguments about what's the original meaning of over. Some say that the original meaning is higher than. So, for example, the painting is over the sofa. So the painting is above the sofa, is higher than the sofa. So that's one argument.
This over is interesting because it has the spatial where it's not moving, but then it also has a sense where it's moving as well.
Right.
Like I went over the bridge.
Right. So that's the argument. So whether the original meaning is a dynamic motion or not.
Right. Yes.
So the other argument would be over means move from one side to the other side.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like cross, but with cross, the spatial configuration is that it's you don't imagine a hurdle in between. So it's a pure horizontal kind of move.
Right. Yeah.
Versus over is you go high to a certain point, across a certain hurdle, and then you move to the other side.
Yeah, right.
Right. So that's the trajectory. So the trajectory is different between over and across. So lots of learners confuse these two.
Is that why I would use the phrase "I got over my cold," for example?
So then that's the metaphorical meaning of over, of moving from one side to another, but it's from moving from one state to another
but
state.
Then there was an obstacle in the middle of my cold.
Exactly. Yeah. So what I do when I teach prepositions is to show the learners the spatial senses, like the cat jumped over the wall, and then compare that with sentences with
more abstract
I
meanings.
got over a cold.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so then they can see the connection between the original meaning of this preposition and its extended metaphorical sense.
Right. Fantastic. All right. So what about, is it the same in other languages? Like in Mandarin, do you have the preposition over?
Interesting. In Mandarin, we don't have something like prepositions.
Whoa. Right. Okay.
In Mandarin, we have something called co-verb.
Oh.
So they take the certain functions as the English preposition, but they can also function as a verb.
Okay. Well, there's almost like a verb feeling to a preposition, a dynamic one,
exactly.
isn't
So
there?
it's like kind of, it has both the features of preposition and also a verb. And so linguists give it a name called co-verb.
Co-verb.
And the co-verb has to jointly work with adverbs, spatial adverbs, to encode the entire meaning.
Okay.
So for example, with in, you need the co-verb 在 plus an adverbial inside. Together, it forms the meaning of containment, of
very
in.
interesting.
And then when it comes to on, you still use the same co-verb 在, and then you use another adverbials, and then different adverbials.
Okay.
So the meaning differentiation is encoded on the adverbials rather than on the co-verb. It looks like the same co-verb encodes different prepositions.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why Chinese learners find English prepositions difficult.
Yeah.
Because essentially it's the same co-verb that's
yeah.
playing the most important functions of
Right.
preposition.
Yeah.
But in English you have different prepositions.
So do you remember how you first came across the preposition over in English and how you translated that across from Mandarin? Or
It's difficult to do translation, actually.
Right.
It's really difficult.
yeah, it's almost like an entirely new concept, isn't
Exactly. So that's why it's really challenging. And the reason why it's difficult to translate is because over has so many different meanings.
Yeah.
There's no one single translation that helps you to do that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of those pains where you look in the dictionary and you go, oh no.
Yeah,
it's
so
like
there's
22 meanings.
Exactly. So you don't know which meaning to select from my first language to help me to kind of understand this
yeah.
preposition, because there's so many different meanings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, so what what we need to do at E2 School is take all of these lessons and apply them to technology, because our aim, well, we've got a twofold aim. We've got E2 Language, which prepares people for their IELTS exams or their PTE exams, etc. And then we've got E2 School, which is for English language learning, like proper, like vocab, pronunciation, grammar. So we're doing the hard work now in the research and building E2 School out. How would you go about putting your knowledge, which is deep and complex, into practical computer-based lessons? Like, for example, with prepositions, do you have an image or a vision of how that would work?
I've already done some experiments on this, applying this way of teaching preposition that I described just now in a tutor, in an online tutor.
Oh, great.
And I've done two studies. One is a behavioral one. The other one is a neuroimaging one. Both have shown that this way of teaching preposition is effective in helping adult second language learners of English to really improve their understanding about the spatial and also extended meanings of prepositions.
And so you did the same thing? You did the cat jumping over the wall and then moved on to the more extended meanings?
Yeah, so the way I help learners to understand the connection in a tutor is basically by using the same sort of schematic diagrams. And these diagrams came from cognitive linguistic research. And so I basically modified these diagrams for the use of second language teaching, because the theoretical diagrams are really highly abstract and learners won't be able to understand. But I sort of modify them, make them into animated diagrams so that learners can see the motion, the dynamic motions, for illustrating the spatial senses. And then for the extended meanings, the learners also see the same schematic diagrams. And then they can make the link themselves by seeing the same diagrams being applied to sentences that express the spatial meaning and also the metaphorical meaning.
Right.
So and the tutor provides lots of practice trials with explicit feedback. And the experiment shows that the findings of both experiments, behavioral and neuroimaging methods, shows that this sort of instruction is quite effective.
Okay, good.
Yeah, with only 1 hour of training.
Okay.
It was pretty robust findings. Yeah.
I've got high hopes for if somebody, us, make the technology right, like do it properly. I really do think we can speed up language learning.
Yeah,
I think a lot of time is wasted in classrooms. Yeah, I think if somebody does it right, we can definitely make it more efficient. Okay, sorry, I just have another quick question just to clarify in my mind. So we talked about prepositions like over, like just the sort of basic preposition. Then we talked about something like getting over it, like get over it, get over your cold or get over your obstacle. They're the phrasal verbs, right? So is it
right? That's a particle. That's a particle.
Right. So the metaphorical meaning or the extended meaning is in the phrasal verb. Is that right?
No. Partially, yes.
Okay.
Phrasal verbs, or typically we call them verb particle constructions, the meaning comes from both. Comes from the verb and also comes from the particle. That's why phrasal verbs are difficult, because preposition, you only have to deal with the preposition.
Yes.
But with verb particle constructions, verb have different meanings. Particle has different meanings, but the combination comes from a certain meaning of the verb and certain meaning of the particle, and that marriage is fixed.
Okay.
It comes created kind of a fixed idiomatic meaning.
Yes.
So that's the trick part.
And there are thousands of phrasal verbs.
Yeah.
So how would you if I'm going to learn phrasal verbs, should I concentrate on the verb or should I learn them by preposition or particle?
phrasal verbs are typically what we consider as chunks in languages. There are different arguments about the best way of teaching phrasal verbs. Some say that you should teach it by adopting a compositional view, just teaching the verb and then teach them the particles and help them to combine the meaning of the two. Some argue that you should just basically teach it as a chunk and allow second language learners to learn phrasal verbs in the same way as native speakers do.
Yeah.
As children learn phrasal verbs when they acquire English as their native language, just by being exposed to lots of phrasal verbs in different contexts. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've thought about this because it is so complicated. Some of the literature that I read said because there is a metaphorical meaning to the particle, to the preposition, concentrate on those, because when you then have a variety of different verbs but the same particle or preposition, there would be some logic. Almost you could work it out. I mean, you obviously need to be taught and told. And
I see. Yeah. The literature. I think the original literature argues that you should teach the verb and then teach them different combinations of the particles, and then help them to figure out the same verb get when it's combined with off, on, away, whatever, and then you get different combinations of meaning. And then it moves the literature kind of moves to another stage where people argue that, we actually should teach on the art of particles and then show them different verb. I think right now people really begin to think phrasal verbs as a chunk.
A chunk, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it may not be entirely effective or helpful for learners to try to figure out so many different meanings.
It'd be a nightmare.
Meanings, and then to decide which one to choose.
Yeah.
It might be just
a chunk.
Much more efficient just to learn it as a chunk.
Sometimes when you have the corresponding verb, or the formal verb, or the single verb, I think it's usually the Latin derivative, and then the phrasal verb that has the corresponding meaning. Sometimes it's just easier to do that. To say this phrasal verb means this single verb. They have the same meaning. I cannot think of one off the top of my head.
That's fine. That's fine. It's
Even
fine.
though there are thousands. But
It's fine. Yeah.
Very interesting. Cool. I think that's it.
Okay,
I think we've
great.
blown some minds out there. And if anybody is listening and you're interested in this, you can certainly check out E2 School. And hopefully we'll be seeing your research in an applied sense very soon, actually, I'm quite determined because articles, for example, are just so confusing, and they've been so confused for so long. I really want to try my best to make a program or a module in a course where people go, okay, and hopefully come out the other end and they've kind of got it.
I that's great. I think that would be really good for these second language learners. Even myself, I'm still having trouble with articles and preposition. These are the things that I struggle with myself.
Yeah, I see it, and I just see there's just a lot of teaching is just wasted on teaching these things and teaching them poorly, and anyway, so that's our aspiration. So
I think that teachers are really I don't think teachers kind of innocent when it comes to this, because the textbooks really do not give very good descriptions.
Yes.
And as I said, that even the kind of the best grammar books that I initially extracted these article rules, they have different ways of categorizing them.
Right.
So it's and then when it comes to textbooks writers, it's even more challenging.
Yes.
To cover everything, and it's impossible to allocate that amount of classroom hours to teach just that thing. It's ridiculous. Nobody's going to do that.
That's right.
So that's why classroom instruction is never going to be enough to really fulfill learners' need when it comes to things like article and preposition, which is considered to be something small.
Yeah. It's not though.
It's not. It's challenging.
Huge.
It's really complicated. So that's why I think technology would be a good way to solve these problems for the learners.
fantastic. I agree. I mean, if you had a course where you could go to the classroom and do communicative practice, speaking and listening practice, more applied tasks, but then in your own time go and work out what's going on with grammar, with prepositions and articles, and that'd be magical. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks for listening to E2Talks. Remember to check out e2language.com for IELTS, PTE, OET and TOEFL courses. Also, e2school.com for general English language learning. Thanks.